The brunch dishes were still in the drying rack at 9:47 p.m. when I found it. I had washed them myself, the way I had been washing them for 16 months, quietly, while everyone else moved to the living room, while my father settled into his chair and my brother Daniel opened a second bottle of wine. My mother, Diane, had drifted to the back porch with her coffee. My father, Warren, was telling a story I had heard before, something about a fishing trip he wanted to take before summer ended, and the room had the particular ease of people who have just survived something and are trying on normal again to see if it still fits. I dried my hands on the dish towel and stood at the kitchen window for a moment. The backyard of the house on Aldeview Terrace looked the same as it always had, the old Douglas fir in the far corner, the raised beds my mother had let go to seed over the winter, the porch light casting its yellow circle onto the wet grass. It was a craftsman bungalow, built in 1938, the kind of house that held its weight differently than newer construction, with plaster walls thick enough to absorb sound and original fir floors that creaked in patterns I had memorized over years of walking through in the dark, so I wouldn't wake anyone. My name is Leah Voss. I am 34 years old, and I had been coming to that house almost every day for 16 months because my parents needed me to and because I was the only one who did. My phone was on the counter next to the dish rack. I picked it up without thinking, the way you pick up a tool you've been reaching for every day so long that the motion has become muscle memory. I had been tracking the property tax renewal date for the Aldeview house since February of the previous year, when my father forgot to pay the first installment, and I found the delinquency notice on the kitchen table under a stack of junk mail. I had set a recurring search reminder. I pulled up the address. The listing loaded in 4 seconds. Professional photography. Wide-angle living room shot. The kitchen with its original tile backsplash. The back garden, photographed in better weather than tonight's, with the raised beds filled in, and the Douglas fir framed neatly in the upper left corner. 3 bedrooms, 1.5 baths, 1,847 square feet. Listed at $589,000. Motivated sellers seeking quick close. Posted that morning at 6:04 a.m. 6 hours before I arrived for brunch. 2 hours before I had woken up. I set the phone face down on the counter. I listened to my father's laugh carry from the living room and my brother's voice rising to meet it. I stood there for a count of 11. Then I picked the phone back up, took 3 screenshots, and texted one word to Marcus Obi, the real estate attorney I had worked with the previous year on a matter involving my own lease dispute. I typed, "Proceed." Then I set the phone back down and finished putting away the dishes. Before I tell you what happened next, tell me where you're watching from right now, and what time it is where you are. Because it was nearly 10 p.m. when I found that listing, and my parents were 30 feet away in the next room, and I want to know how far story travels when it starts in a kitchen on a quiet street in Portland. I need to tell you who I was before any of this, and what 16 months looked like from the inside. I have been a registered nurse for 9 years, specializing in home health coordination. What that means in practice is that I am the person who sits across from a patient's family and helps them understand what comes next, what questions to ask the cardiologist, how to arrange the medication schedule, when home nursing visits are sufficient, and when they are not. I am very good at this work. I am good at it partly because of training and partly because I have a particular tolerance for ambiguity and bad news that some people have, and some people do not. I mention this because it is relevant to everything that followed. The skills I used in my professional life, anticipating deterioration, building documentation systems, staying calm when the person across from me was frightened, are the same skills my family borrowed for 16 months and then tried very hard to pretend I had not used. My parents had lived on Aldeview Terrace in Northeast Portland since 1997. My father, Warren, had worked in commercial insurance for 30 years. My mother, Diane, taught elementary school until she retired in 2021. The house was paid off. It was the largest asset they had, worth somewhere between $540,000 and $600,000 depending on the market, which had been moving unpredictably since 2023. My older brother Daniel lived 40 minutes away in Hillsborough with his wife Cass and their 2 sons. He was a project manager for a mid-sized construction firm and had, over the years, developed a talent for being available for the pleasant parts of family life and unavailable for the difficult ones. In October of 2023, my father had a mini-stroke. The medical term is a transient ischemic attack, a TIA, and the doctors at Providence Portland were careful to explain that while the immediate event had resolved, it was a serious warning signal. His blood pressure had been uncontrolled for longer than anyone had realized. His neurologist, Dr. Amara Solis, outlined a care plan that included medication adjustments, twice-weekly blood pressure monitoring, and temporary restrictions on driving and strenuous activity. She also recommended a home health aide for at least the first 6 weeks. My mother called me at 7:22 p.m. that first evening from the hospital room. She said, "I don't know how to do all of this, Leah. I don't know how any of this works." I said, "I know how it works. I'll come." I drove to Providence that night and stayed until 11:40 p.m. reviewing the discharge paperwork with the attending nurse, Dr. Solis's coordinator, and the pharmacy liaison. I made lists. I asked the questions my parents had not thought to ask. The next morning, I coordinated the home health aid referral with a home care agency named Clearwater Health Services on S.E. Hawthorne, where I knew the intake coordinator, Kendra Holt, from professional overlap. Kendra arranged twice-weekly visits from an aide named Rosa, who came Mondays and Thursdays for the first 4 months. What began as 6 weeks became 16 months. My father's recovery was slower than the initial prognosis suggested. His blood pressure stabilized, but his fatigue was significant, and a follow-up MRI in January of 2024 showed a small area of white matter change that Dr. Solis wanted to monitor carefully. She was not alarmed, she told me. She told me, specifically, at 2:15 p.m. on January 16th, because I was the one who attended that appointment while my mother waited in the car because the parking structure made her anxious. She said, "Watch for cognitive lapses. Watch for anything that seems out of pattern. Call me before you call the emergency line." I watched. I called. I drove to Alderview Terrace on average 4 times a week. I kept a shared care notes document in Google Drive that I updated after every appointment and every significant conversation with my father's medical team. I added Kendra Holt as a viewer. I added the after-hours line for Providence's neurology department. I did not add my brother Daniel because Daniel had never asked for the link. Daniel came to see my parents 6 times in 16 months. I know because I tracked the visits in the care notes document, not out of resentment at first, but because I was monitoring my father's emotional state and visits had measurable impact on it. By the 4th or 5th entry, I understood that I was keeping a record. I kept it anyway. My parents told me at various points during those 16 months that my contribution to the family was being noticed. My mother said it in almost exactly those words in March of 2024, standing in the Alderview kitchen while I refilled my father's weekly pill organizer. She said, "We see what you're doing, Leah. This won't go unacknowledged." My father said something similar in May, after a particularly difficult week when his blood pressure spiked twice, and I had driven to the house at 6:38 a.m. on a Thursday after my mother called me in a panic about a reading on the home monitor. He sat at the kitchen table while I took his pressure manually and said, quietly, that I was keeping everything together, that the house felt held, somehow, when I was in it. I did not ask what any of that meant specifically. I should have. I let it mean what I needed it to mean. In June of 2024, Daniel drove up from Hillsborough for Sunday dinner and announced, over my mother's roast chicken, that he and Cass had been thinking about the future of the house, what would make the most sense for everyone, and that he wanted the family to have that conversation before any decisions got made. He said it the way people say things they have already decided, in the tone of someone presenting a foregone conclusion as an invitation. My father nodded in a way that was hard to read. My mother passed the green beans. I looked at Daniel, and he looked back at me with an expression that was almost apologetic, the way people look when they've decided to do something that has a cost, and they've already internally accepted that cost on someone else's behalf. I said nothing at that dinner. I drove home at 8:53 p.m. and sat in my car in front of my apartment building for 14 minutes before going inside. What I understood about Daniel by that point was something I had known for years but had never named clearly enough to act on. He was not cruel. He was not calculating in the way someone with bad intentions is calculating. He simply operated on the assumption that the family's resources, including the family's most productive people, would always be available to him without requiring reciprocal investment. He had done this since childhood. He had done it in the way that good-natured people do it, with charm and warmth and the genuine belief that everyone felt fine about the arrangement. What no one had told him, because no one had ever made it cost anything, was that the arrangement worked only because someone else was covering the difference. That someone had been me. For 16 months, it had been very clearly me. And because the work I did looked like nursing, because it fit the category of what Leah does professionally, because it slotted neatly into the story of a competent woman doing what came naturally, it had become, in the family's accounting, invisible. 2 weeks after that Sunday dinner, I had a conversation with an attorney. Marcus Obi had handled a lease dispute for me the previous spring, a situation involving a property management company that had misrepresented the terms of a sublease renewal. He was methodical and quietly efficient in a way I appreciated, and at the end of that matter, he had said simply that property questions had a way of coming back. I kept his number. I called Marcus on June 18, 2024, at 12:07 p.m., and I asked him a question I had been circling for months without letting myself fully form. If I had been functioning as the primary caregiver for my parents over an extended period, and if I had reason to believe the family's most significant asset might be transferred or sold in a way that excluded my contributions, what were my options? He asked 2 questions. First, had there been any written or verbal commitment about my interest in the property? I said verbal, multiple times from both parents, in the form of acknowledgement language rather than explicit promises. He noted this. Second, did I have documentation of my contributions, time, money, professional acts? I said yes, and I described the care notes document, the prescription receipts, the mileage log I had started keeping in February, and the Clearwater Health Services invoices I had paid for 3 months when my parents' insurance reimbursement lagged. Marcus said, "Keep building that record. Don't change anything. Don't say anything to your parents or your brother about this conversation. If something happens, call me before you respond to it." I said, "Okay." I kept building the record. I kept showing up. I kept not saying anything. My father's final clearance appointment with Dr. Solis was on the morning of August 9, 2025. I drove him there. We sat in the same waiting room I had been sitting in for 18 months, and Dr. Solis came out looking unhurried, which I had learned to read as a good sign. She told my father that his pressure had been stable for 6 consecutive months. The white matter area was unchanged. And she was lifting the driving restriction and the activity limitations. She wanted to check in 6 months, standard protocol. He could resume his normal life. My father gripped my hand in the elevator on the way down. He did not say anything. Neither did I. My mother had organized a brunch for the following Saturday, August 16th, to mark the occasion. She had made the frittatas she made for birthdays and called it a celebration. Daniel and Cass came with the boys. My father sat at the head of the table looking rested in a way I had not seen in a long time, and everyone talked about the fishing trip and fall plans and whether the boys would make travel soccer this year. It was, in every surface way, a happy morning. What I noticed was the ease. Not the ease itself, that was earned, and I was glad for it. What I noticed was what the ease was doing to the room. It was smoothing over the previous 16 months the way warm water smooths plaster, filling in the crevices until the surface looks even. I watched my brother laugh at something my father said, and I thought, he has no idea what the last 16 months cost. Not the money, though that was real too. The $2,340 in prescription copays I had covered when my parents' supplemental insurance had a gap, the $1,870 in Clearwater invoices, the $318 in mileage at the IRS reimbursement rate. He had no idea what the 4 a.m. phone calls had cost, or the 6:38 a.m. blood pressure drives, or the 18 months of being the person whose phone was never fully off. I helped clean up after brunch. I washed the dishes. I drove home at 2:14 p.m. and told myself I was being ungenerous, that families are imperfect, that my father's health improving was the point, and I should let it be the point. At 9:47 p.m. I searched the address out of habit. I sat in the kitchen for a long time after I found the listing, not panicking, not crying. Something in me went physically cold in the way your hands go cold when you have been outside longer than you realized, and your body is only now catching up to the temperature. I kept hearing the brunch sounds from earlier, My father's laugh, the boys running in the backyard, my mother's voice saying we should do this every week now, and they kept landing differently against what I was reading on the screen. Posted at 6:04 a.m. That was before the brunch. That was before my mother made the frittata. That was before my father sat at the head of the table looking rested and talked about the fishing trip. They had listed the house in the morning and invited me to celebrate in the afternoon. And when the frittata was gone and the dishes were washed and I had driven away at 2:14 p.m., the listing was still live, with its professional photographs and its motivated seller's note, waiting for someone to click. I walked out of my apartment at 10:09 p.m. I needed to move. I walked down my street and around the block and then further, past the convenience store on the corner and the church with the broken gutter and the park where the dog walkers went in the mornings, and I walked until the cold air had cleared the particular numbness that had settled over the brunch sounds in my head. I walked for 31 minutes. Then I went back inside and opened my laptop. Marcus Obi had responded to my one-word text at 10:52 p.m. He said, "Call me in the morning." 8 a.m. I spent the next hour building the complete documentation. I exported the Google Drive Care Notes log, 87 entries over 16 months, each timestamped, each with a provider name and the purpose of the contact. I pulled every prescription receipt I had photographed. I opened the Clearwater Health Services invoices and made a PDF. I printed my mileage log. I pulled the Google Maps timeline for the past 16 months and ran the calculation. 214 trips to Aldeview Terrace. An average of 13.4 per month. Approximately 6,420 miles total at the IRS rate of 67 cents per mile, which came to $4,301.40 in uncompensated mileage alone, not counting the $4,528 in direct expense payments I could document with receipts. I did not sleep much that night, but I was not afraid of what came next. At 8:03 a.m. on August 17, 2025, I called Marcus Obi. He picked up on the first ring, and I could tell from the quality of his silence that he had already been thinking about this since my text the night before. I walked him through the listing, the timing, and the documentation I had built overnight. He asked whether I had spoken to my parents. I said no. He said, "Good. Don't." He said, "The listing itself is not automatically actionable. The house is in their name, and they have the right to sell it. What we are looking at is whether their explicit and repeated verbal acknowledgments of your contribution, combined with your documented financial and time investment in the property, creates a reasonable claim for unjust enrichment or promissory estoppel under Oregon law." He said both were worth pursuing. He said the documentation I had built overnight was, and I quote, "more thorough than anything a professional would have asked you to prepare in advance." He said, "When did you know you might need this?" I said, "June of last year, when my brother started talking about the house's future at dinner." Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Good instincts. Let me draft a letter." The letter went to my parents via certified mail on August 22, 2025, and by email to both of them that same afternoon. I know the exact moment my father read it because he called me at 3:37 p.m. and did not say hello. He said, "Leah, what is this?" His voice was not angry. It was the voice of a man who has just understood something he did not expect to have to understand. I said, "It's a letter from my attorney. If you want to talk about it, call Marcus Obi directly. His number is on the header." My father said, "We weren't going to cut you out. We were going to talk to you about all of this." I said, "I know, Dad. Call Marcus." Daniel called 20 minutes later. His voice was different, controlled in the way that meant he was working to keep it controlled. He said Cass and he had been discussing this for months, that it was just an estate planning conversation, that he and I had always been treated equally, and that going to a lawyer was making the family look bad. He said, "You're a nurse, Leah. You were helping because that's what you do. That's not the same thing as a financial claim." I let him finish. Then I said, "I drove to that house 214 times, Daniel. I paid $4,500 out of pocket. I attended every appointment your father had with his neurologist. I think it's the same thing." He did not have an answer for that. He hung up. My mother called at 7:18 p.m. and cried. The real kind. She said she had not known about the listing, that my father had handled it with Daniel, that she had assumed everyone would have a conversation first. I believed part of that. I also knew that my mother had been at the brunch. She had made the frittata. She had said we should do this every week now while the listing was live on the internet with her name on it. I said, "Mom, talk to Marcus. That's all I need right now." Marcus and my parents' attorney, a man named Robert Tanaka, who practiced estate law in Lake Oswego, exchanged correspondence over the following 3 weeks. The negotiation was not dramatic. Robert's initial position was that my contributions had been voluntary acts of family care without any enforceable financial expectation. Marcus countered with the documented record, the 87-entry care log, the expense receipts, the mileage calculation, and 2 specific dates in 2024 on which my mother had told me, in writing by text message, that my role was being seen and would be acknowledged. Those 2 texts were the most important documents in the file. My mother had not remembered sending them. People rarely do. What I learned during those 3 weeks, from a combination of what Marcus uncovered through the discovery process and what my mother let slip during 2 phone calls she should not have made without her attorney present, was the fuller shape of what had been planned. Daniel had approached my parents in early spring of 2025, approximately 5 months before my father's clearance appointment, about the possibility of listing the house. His argument, as my mother described it, was that the market in Northeast Portland was strong and that waiting until my father's health made him less capable of understanding the transaction was not in anyone's interest. He had found Sandra Osei through a colleague's recommendation and had facilitated the listing appointment himself. My parents had signed the listing agreement on August 12, 2025, 3 days before the clearance brunch. 3 days before. My mother told me she had not realized the listing would go live so soon. She had thought there would be more time before anyone saw it. She said, "I thought we would tell you before it came out, Leah. I thought Daniel was going to call you." I sat with that sentence for a long time. I thought Daniel was going to call you. The assumption that someone else would manage the uncomfortable part was so deeply embedded that my mother had signed a real estate listing agreement and genuinely expected to be insulated from the conversation it would require. That was not malice. It was something more ordinary, and in some ways harder to forgive, the practiced habit of letting the difficult things fall to the person who had always handled difficult things. I said, "Mom, when was Daniel going to call me? Before or after the sale closed?" She did not answer. I said, "Talk to Robert. That's where this conversation belongs." On September 11, 2025, Robert Tanaka proposed a settlement, $53,400, structured as a direct payment from the proceeds of the house sale, to be transferred within 30 days of closing. My parents would continue with the sale. I would release any further claim. Marcus said the number was fair given the documentation and the cost of a litigated alternative. He also said that Robert had made one unusual request, that the settlement agreement include a clause acknowledging that the payment represented recognition of my caretaking contributions, not merely a nuisance settlement. Robert had apparently suggested this himself. Marcus said he believed it came from my father. I said, "Accept it with the acknowledgement clause." The house closed on October 3, 2025. The $53,400 transferred to my account on October 7th, a Tuesday, at 2:19 p.m. I was sitting in a patient's living room in Southeast Portland doing an intake assessment when my phone buzzed. I finished the assessment. I drove back to the office. I wrote up the intake notes and submitted them before 5 p.m. I did not tell anyone at work. I did not post anything. I drove home on the same route I always drove, through the same lights, past the same convenience store on the corner. I stopped at the grocery store the way I stopped on any Tuesday. The only thing I did differently was stand in the wine aisle for a few minutes longer than usual, looking at a bottle I had been meaning to buy for months, and not buying because it felt like a celebration for something that hadn't resolved yet. I bought it. I took it home. I did not open it that night. I opened it 2 weeks later, on an evening in October, when the rain was doing the particular thing Portland rain does in autumn, steady and unhurried, the kind that settles into the streets and the gutters and the spaces between buildings like it has nowhere else to be. I poured a glass and sat at my kitchen table and let myself feel what I had not let myself feel while the whole thing was still in motion. The grief in it. Not just the anger, which had been manageable, but the grief for the version of my parents I had believed in long enough to show up 214 times, for the version of my brother that had never quite existed, for the house on Aldeview Terrace and the Douglas fir in the back corner, and the raised beds my mother had stopped tending. I want to tell you that the settlement fixed the grief the way it fixed the financial accounting. It did not. The $53,400 was real, and it was right, and I do not regret any part of pursuing it. But there is no amount that precisely converts 16 months of 4 a.m. phone calls into a number that makes the ledger feel even. What the settlement did was something different. It created a record. It said, in a document signed by 4 attorneys and filed with the court, that what I had done was real and had value. No one could look back at those 16 months and call them habit, or instinct, or just something Leah does. They were in the record now. That mattered more than I expected it to. On a Friday evening in November, I drove to the coast. Not with anyone, just myself, the way I sometimes drove when I needed air that smelled like something other than the city. I went to Cannon Beach, which I had been going to since I was a child, and I parked near the beach access and walked down to the water in the late afternoon. The tide was going out. The light was the low, flat gold that the Oregon coast gets in November, the kind that doesn't last long, and is beautiful partly because you know it won't. I stood there for a while with my hands in my coat pockets and let the wind pull at my hair and thought about nothing specific, just the water and the light, and the fact that I was there and the day had been ordinary. My father called while I was standing at the waterline. I almost let it go to voicemail. Then I answered. He said, "Where are you?" I said, "Cannon Beach." He said, "Alone?" I said, "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'm sorry, Leah, for how it was handled. I let other people do my thinking, and I shouldn't have. I should have talked to you directly." I looked at the water. A gull dropped low over the surf line, and then rose back up, and the light shifted for a moment in the way it does when a cloud moves, and then steadied again. I said, "I know, Dad. I'm here." He said, "Can we go to the coast sometime? You and me?" I said, "Yes." We did. In December, a Saturday, overcast but dry, the way the coast is in winter. We walked on the same beach and talked about small things. The fishing trip he still wanted to take, a book he was reading, a repair on the gutters at the new apartment he and my mother had moved to after the Alderview sale. We did not talk about the legal proceedings or the letter or the settlement. There was nothing left to say about those things that had not already been said in writing with 4 signatures on it. What was left was this: the beach and the cold air and my father walking beside me at the pace of someone who has been very unwell and is glad to be moving again. That was enough. I mean that without bitterness. Sometimes enough is the right amount, and knowing the difference between enough and everything is one of the more useful things a person can learn. There is something I have thought about a great deal since then, something I want to say carefully because it matters. Being good at caring for people does not make you responsible for what they do with the care you give them. A nurse shows up. A daughter shows up. The showing up is real. The cost of it is real. And when the people you showed up for look at 16 months of your life and see only habit, something she does anyway, something that doesn't count, the most important thing you can do is have the records that say otherwise. I am still close to my father. That took some work, and I am glad we did the work. He called me in November and asked if I would drive with him to the coast for a weekend, just the 2 of us, and I said yes. We walked on the beach at Cannon Beach in the late afternoon light, and he said, at some point while we were watching the surf, that he was sorry for how things had been handled. He said, "I let other people do my thinking for me, and I shouldn't have." I said, "I know. I'm here." That was enough. Sometimes enough is the right amount. I am not close to Daniel. That is also something I have accepted. Some distances are the right size. My mother and I are finding our way back, slowly. She texts me recipes sometimes. I respond. That is where we are, and I have stopped trying to make it more than that while the ground is still settling. Here is what I leave you with, and I mean it plainly. The records you keep are not distrust. They are the quiet insurance of someone who understands that love and fairness are not the same thing. that people who love you can still, without meaning to, treat you as the one whose time doesn't cost anything, whose effort falls into the category of things she does anyway. Documenting what you give is not cold. It is honest. And honesty, in a family dispute, is the only currency that holds its value. The Aldeview house has new owners now. A young couple, I think, from what I could tell by the brief online listing that replaced my parents'. The Douglas fir is still in the back corner. The raised beds are probably still there. I hope whoever lives there uses them. I made the roast chicken again last week, on a Thursday evening, without occasion. The apartment smelled the way it had that night in October. Outside my window the street was wet, the way Portland streets get in November, with the light catching the pavement in that particular way that makes everything look briefly silver. I stood at the window with my glass and watched it for a while. Before you go, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. Is it light or dark? Is it the kind of night where a story about a house and a listing and a woman standing at her kitchen window feels familiar, or the kind where it feels like something that happens to other people? And one more thing. If you were Leah, if you found the listing at 9:47 p.m. while the brunch dishes were still in the drying rack and your parents were 30 feet away laughing in the living room, would you have walked back in there and asked them